Hey everybody, it's Alex. Welcome back to Old Man Badly. Not doing video games today. Today we're back kicking the can of Right to Repair and a video that Louis Rossmann put up today. And I have a hard time reading Louis sometimes because his sense of humor is a little bit dry. Okay, it's powder. Very hard to tell when Louis is really telling you the truth and when he's just winding you up a little bit to see what you're going to say. But let's go give it a shot. It's actually pretty funny.
Old man playing video games badly.
So I was watching this video from Louis, and it's not this one that's on my screen. It's actually called An Intellectual Property Red Pill, The Real Reason for Right to Repair Opposition. I got to speak to a few people at two different technology firms with varying levels of experience, and I'm starting to piece the puzzle together. Okay, so that's his supposition. His idea is this. The reason why you can't get schematics is because a lot of companies contract out to companies such as Foxconn and so on to actually design and build their boards for them. And what's happened is Foxconn is, I guess he implies a certain amount of copy pasting boards and reselling them more than one. And the reason you can't have schematics is because, well, they'd all know they were ripping off each other's IP. I went with it, but it's sort of, I was trying not to giggle. Let's hear kind of what he has to say.
So I think something similar is happening here. It may not even be that it's about keeping you from fixing your own stuff. It may be because every one of these companies knows that they're taking each other's intellectual property. Not even because they want to, just because who the fuck wants to reinvent the wheel?
And again, all the reasons why I really, really love Louis is because even if he's goofing around and he's trying to kind of tell us a bit of a joke, he tells it in the same tone, so you never know quite where he's at. And Louis uses the example of things like, in this case, like things like a Wi-Fi circuit, right? And his explanation, his supposition basically is you can't get a schematic for a Lenovo computer because the reality is the Lenovo computer is the exact same motherboard as the Dell computer also made by Foxconn. And if they released the schematics, they both know they'd ripped each other's IP off and that they had both paid for designs that were the same. And then therefore there would be companies suing each other because there'd be all sorts of IP issues between Dell and Lenovo. And I love it, but he's wrong. Well, no, not that he's wrong. It's just he's coming to the wrong conclusion because he's got the wrong belief as to who is the actual IP rights holder. Let me explain. If you've ever seen a PC motherboard, a PC motherboard is a pretty standard thing. There's standard sizes, except for Asus's stupid sizes. But generally, motherboards come in form factors such as ITX, ETX, ATX, ATX being the most common. And those, when you make an ATX motherboard, there are things that are fixed. Where the back panel is fixed. Where the card slots are generally is fixed. The placement of the board is fixed. The size of the board, where the screw holes are. A whole bunch of things are already hard-coded. So if you want to make an ATX board, you take your blank ATX board design thing and go paste. You have to. Your panel has to be there to fit an ATX motherboard case. Your card slots have to be there to fit a standard ATX motherboard case again. The screw holes have to be there to go in the case and so on. And then when it comes right down to it, from there, the design is pretty much standardized across the industry. So you have your back panel. In front of your back panel, you have your VRMs, which surround your motherboard, your main CPU socket. Next to your CPU socket is your RAM. That's the edge of the board. You go down the board, and you have your various components, your SATA ports or your whatever ports you want to have. Across the bottom, you have all your connectors for your power, and your lights and your LEDs on the case and all sorts of stuff, all in a nice standard location, because that's how long the cable is, right? Again, the guys who make the cases make them with these assumptions, and the guys who build the boards make it with the cases assumption that the case is going to do that. And you go across the back, and then your card slots are here, and there's a certain number of card slot spaces allocated in an ATX motherboard, and their spacing is defined so that when you build the case, the slots line up with the case holes, things like that. It's all pretty standard. Now, beyond that is the question of componentry. And when a company builds a Wi-Fi chip, as an example, one of the things that will come with that chip is an engineered design for the circuitry to support it. So you will have the chip, and then you'll have a certain number of discrete components around it required to make that chip actually function, and to show how it connects to, in the computer world, to the bus, or to the I/O chip, or to however it connects standardly to the system. And that standard doesn't change from chip to chip. Wi-Fi chips connect in the same manner. You can connect here, or you can connect, there's kind of like very few options. Usually a PCI, and away you go. It's usually not a circuit board design. It's usually a circuit design. So a paper drawing with a chip and lines and little components, and they tell you how the circuit is built. And this is the basis of how that company's Wi-Fi chip works, or that company's SATA chip works, or that company's sound chip works. And companies like Foxconn or whoever will have these things basically pre-designed. They will have a certain amount of space required, and they will have a circuit design for a Wi-Fi chip. And that space is, say, 1 inch by 1 inch on the board, and it requires a certain number of traces to come from the processor to a certain point where they're going to meet. And there's going to be certain other things for power and stuff like that. And it's going to be standard pretty much on all of them. And there'll be little connectors, and it'll show how the wire goes from there to the little Wi-Fi connectors. So it's all very standard. So if you are a company like Lenovo and you say, I want a motherboard and I want it to have Wi-Fi 6 on it, you go and you pull your design, your 1x1 square of Wi-Fi 6, and you put it on your board. Oh, and the board, by the way, let's say a B550 motherboard, very common for AMD. Foxconn is not going to reinvent the wheel for every board they make. Okay? They will have a very standard board design, which will have space for that 1x1 square for the Wi-Fi if you want it, and the space for the SATA over here, and the space for the audio. And you will have options based on what you want to do. And they will have a controller chip for USB, and you may want to have 2 controller chips for USB. You may have 2 complete USB hubs. You may want to have 2 network cards. You may want to have 10 USB ports exposed. You may want to only have 2 USB ports exposed. Each company comes to a company like Foxconn and says, hey, we need an ATX motherboard, and we need it to have 6 USB ports, and we need it to have Wi-Fi 6 and a 1 gig network card. ATX form factor, B550. How much? And Foxconn will come back and they'll give them a price, and the price isn't too... There's going to be obviously some design money in there because they have to actually assemble it and thing. But the reality is they're not selling them the design. They're actually licensing them the design. Foxconn still generally would own it. And the circuitry to run the Wi-Fi, while The board level stuff is probably Foxconn that developed their particular parts placement. The reality is the circuit itself was created by the company that built the Wi-Fi, and they may in fact have just licensed that to Foxconn. So the lack of schematics a lot of the time isn't because there's a lack of some grand scheme not to compete on IP. The reality is most of these boards, a lot of these boards for companies like Dell and Lenovo and other companies that use their own motherboards. It's not their own motherboards. They've contracted it out to one of a very small handful of companies who pull an off-shelf design and modify it lightly to do a production run, and they license their design IP to Lenovo or to Dell for that variation of the board, period. Because Dell and Lenovo do not want to spend the money to design it. They want to spend the money on a per unit basis so they know how much it's going to cost them to build computers so they can sell them at a profit. So they don't want to own. Dell and Lenovo have no benefit in owning motherboard designs from 10 years ago. There's no money in it. It's much better for them just to license a pre-made board design with some custom features to make it their own, including perhaps having their logo splashed across it. But the reality is, who actually owns the IP? So it's not Lenovo or Dell saying you can't have a schematic. The reality is Dell and Lenovo probably don't even have a schematic to give you because they don't own it either. And there's no reason for Foxconn to want to give it out because, to be honest with you, that's what Foxconn is selling. And if they give out that schematic, trust me, somebody else will knock it off 20 minutes later. It's bad enough that they put the boards out there and the boards get reverse engineered. If they put the schematic out there, the board level schematic out there, it would be a no-brainer for companies to knock off exact clones and copies. And that would be a problem. And where Foxconn is making their money is right there. And telling them, well, you got to tell everybody how you do it. Why would they do it? There's not going to be any more money in it. So, the other part of it is that, truth be told, Foxconn often doesn't own the rights to their own stuff either, because they may have licensed it from the companies that made the SATA controller or made the sound controller or made the Wi-Fi controller or the network controller, and the circuitry itself may only just be licensed to them and not actually of their own. You never know. It's not a simple thing. It's not a monolithic company X owns it all. They don't. A lot of times it's an assemblage. And the rights are all over the road and they're not in a straight line. So as much as it would be just a case of they're not giving you the schematics because they don't want everybody to know that they are ripping each other off and they don't want to have lawsuits, the reality is I doubt highly that Lenovo or Dell or whoever owns 100% of the IP related to a motherboard that's in their systems. And in fact, I would bet you they own very little of it. At best, they own a limited license right to a particular variation that they've paid to have developed, but they don't own the rights to the board as a whole. They probably had to license 90% of it, and they may own only the last 10%. Mostly their logo in etched in the board. So yeah, it's a kind of one of those things. But like I said, I do support right to repair. Very much, actually. I think things should be able to be repaired. But at the same time, too, I also understand that in a lot of things, unfortunately, even with the right to repair. Repair is not logical. It's not financially viable. If you can buy a motherboard for $100 and Louis is going to charge you $100 to open your computer to check your motherboard, okay? It is cheaper, especially in the PC world, just to get another motherboard. Fact of life. The only time that there's any debate on this is when you start dealing with companies like Apple, who have completely and utterly custom made and have their own custom IP, and that's a different ballgame altogether. Apple creates their own stuff more or less from scratch, often designing their own chips for their systems. And yes, Apple does have schematics for their products because they make their own. Their boards are custom, and that's just the way it works. It's just not as simple. I wish it was as simple as everybody wants to make it out to be, but realistically, it never is. Even Apple, for the longest time, of course, was using Intel chips, or they were using other people's Wi-Fi chips or whatever. At a certain point, they've licensed a certain amount of IP as well, and they may not be in a position to provide you all of the schematics because there may be certain things that they're using that's licensed as opposed to theirs, and they may not be in a position to provide it to you. That's just the nature of the game, because, like I said, we're not dealing with monolithic companies. We can also look, and I'll do this really quickly, just a last minute here. In the car world, same thing. You can go look up, I believe the company is called Tanaka. Let me just go see. Recalled airbags. Yes, Takata. You can go read about the Takata airbag recall, which touches almost every car company in the world, because almost every car company in the world used Takata airbags at some point. Toyotas and Hondas, lots of Japanese-made cars all had the same basic airbag in it. It's not, Honda doesn't own the IP rights to it, and Toyota doesn't own it. It's a company called Takata that owns the rights. And so when it comes down to the question of liability, as I talked about in a previous video, link up there, you have a lot of people in the chain and you have a lot of responsibility in the chain. So when it comes to publishing a schematic, you have the question of IP rights and you have the question of liability based on it. So it's not always as easy as that, because there's a lot of hands. In a modern product, there's lots and lots of people, lots and lots of companies, lots and lots of overlapping rights, and lots of overlapping property, IP, that has to be dealt with. So it's not always that simple. All right, once again, thanks for watching the video. And Louis, keep up the fight. Okay, if you're watching this video and you're watching to the end, first of all, thanks for watching to the end. But keep up the good fight. And keep up with the humor, because it's really hard to tell when you're being funny. But when you are, it is funny. Catch you next time.
Old man playing video games badly.